Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. Thanks to Open Teams for having me for this talk. And my name is Avi Press. I'm the founder and CEO of Scarf, a company that provides sales and marketing intelligence for open source companies. Um, and today we're going to talk about a new framework to think about marketing in the commercial open source space that we call open source qualified leads. Um, my background is as an open source software developer. I was once in the position of having my own open source tools that had commercial traction. I'm trying to make this decision of do I quit my job to work on my open source projects full time? And really lacking the data about how to make that decision in a good way, and knowing what to do next of how do I actually run a go-to-market process for a business that I want to start around open source, which has taken me on the very long journey of of starting Scarf the company and really thinking really deeply a lot about how commercial open source businesses should do sales and marketing, how that's different from traditional companies, et cetera. And so, cool. On that note, let's dive into it. Um, so I think most of you here probably resonate with this idea that there's a huge difference between providing valuable software to the open source community and actually running a business. If all of your users were companies, you wouldn't be here. There'd be no problem. Everything would be great, but it does not work that way, unfortunately, most of the time. Where there's a really big gap between getting acquiring lots of users for an open source project and actually converting that into a sustainable and thriving business. A really huge gap in those things. And I think there's a lot of reasons for that. Obviously all the sacrifices and trade-offs that we make to open source our software, it comes with some really, really strong advantages, but it makes our job as marketers, as go-to-market people broadly, a lot harder in other ways. And I think the way that we think about marketing in this environment is one of those things that's really responsible for a lot of that. And so, I think it's important to start with, how as marketers, how do we think about our funnel? Um, and in the traditional world of marketing, there's a very standard funnel that I think your company might use some modified flavor of this, but they all take a pretty similar form, which is that um, the marketing activities that you do, the content that you publish, the events that you attend and sponsor, they all drive these touch points with folks that become known and leads. You nurture those leads to qualify them on your marketing team and push them towards your sales team, where they get accepted and qualified and ultimately, hopefully, become a customer. And these kinds of touch points, whether it's them landing on your website, them opening one of your marketing emails, reading a blog post, these kinds of things, they all take place in content that you own, that you control, that you can observe and see and measure. And the whole flow follows something straight from there, where you basically have visibility into most of what's happening. Um, and I think what we learn by being in a commercial open source context is that this doesn't really capture a pretty broad range of what you care about. The journey that an open source user might take might look very different, right? But this is the framework that we as marketers have, and what we tend to do is try to map this process onto our open source business. And there tends to be some mismatch there, right? And not just mismatch, but some other problems too. And that's largely that as an open, as a creator of open source, your data that corresponds to this, to this pipeline that we see here, like all the metrics and the metrics and what you're measuring here are all very straightforward. But in the open source context, this data is this funnel doesn't map to it, right? The data that you have is going to be spread out across a lot of different platforms, and you only have a small part of it, right? So, if you distribute your packages, your artifacts on a registry, you're basically working with raw download numbers that might be very misleading, right? If you have 5 million downloads for your package, how many people is that? That literally could be from one person. And not to say that's often what's happening. Um, our data at Scarf suggests that this tends to be about a factor of 100 to 1,000 in terms of 5 million downloads. How many people were behind that? Yeah, we would guess about a hundredth or a hundredth to a thousandth of that, but that's kind of the window of what we tend to see across our data set at Scarf. So, you're working with a very small amount of information here out of something like GitHub and PyPI and Docker Hub and these kinds of things, where you are largely working off these raw download numbers that are unscrubbed, and so they can often lead you astray. But it's worse than that, right? It's also that these events are anonymous. You can't tie them to an account most of the time. Even if you somehow have that data, it's often fully anonymized. And so what that means is that, of the user journey with an open source project, someone that learns about your project on social media and maybe goes to your GitHub and reads the README and checks it out and downloads it and starts to use it, like that's a lot of stuff. That's a lot of interactions and intent signaling that are just not incorporated into this traditional marketing funnel. It's not robust to this kind of other pathway, right? And so um, basically we have all of these interactions and intent signals that don't map well to this framework that most businesses have been using for a really long time. um, but the problem gets even worse, right? So these touch points are all happening in different places, and you don't control those places often. So if someone goes and lands on your readme on GitHub, you're not going to get the analytics out of that like you would if they landed on your website, right? And so that's why a lot of folks will opt to put their documentation on their own website. Maybe just GitHub pages or whatever it is that you're using, but at least then it's happening on your property and you have more ownership of that channel, right? But so from people reading about it to people downloading it to using it, like these are all happening in different places. And so that means these touch points are happening in places that you can't easily correlate to one another. So, like, did this person who read the docs, the same person that did the download, that did the usage subsequently? Stitching those together can be very, very difficult. And this problem gets even worse if your software happens to be hosted by a foundation, right? I think maybe some of us here are working on and commercializing software that is held in a foundation. You forfeit even less control over this stuff, and that makes your job as a marketer even harder, right? Because ultimately, the ownership of the platforms that are doing this stuff, that comes with leverage to measure and track these kinds of things. And then ultimately it becomes the leverage to sell something, to capture some of the value that you're creating and giving away. And all of these different pieces like this, that we have this incomplete data, this missing data, this anonymous data, this disparate and disjoint data. All those things lead to marketing processes that do lead scoring in a very weak fashion, right? Um, if we want to do lead scoring, we want to know, things about the company firmographics, like, does this company, is this company the right size? Are they the right industry and the right location? All these kinds of things that are kind of, table stakes for lead scoring. But really the meat of lead scoring is about intent. It's about behaviors. It's about, is this prospect actually showing signals that they want to buy something? And are they showing that they want to buy something this quarter? And those kinds of signals, I think, are going to be largely missing because most of the touch points, interactions you actually care about are happening in places that you're not seeing, and they're happening in places that don't fit into your traditional um, your traditional funnel and your traditional marketing framework. And so really this problem here is that we as marketers in the commercial open source space are using a funnel that doesn't map to the reality of our business. Um, and that's really like the crux of the problem, right? Like we as open source businesses basically making the case that we've given away our software for free, and in return we've cultivated a thriving user base and a community by eliminating all the friction to adopt our software. And that benefit means we have this broad audience of potential customers, and we are going to work to convert those users into customers. And all of that stuff really relies on us being able to do that conversion effectively, for us to measure the efficacy of those initiatives and then optimize them. And if we're using the wrong funnel, if the funnel that we are using is not mapping to our reality, our efforts to optimize these things are going to be very ineffective fundamentally. And that's the goal of this talk here, is to try to come to a framework that maps to our reality more effectively, so our efforts can be more streamlined, more data driven, and more optimized. So what is this open source funnel, right? So if our users of our open source software are going along a different path, and for a more traditional like SaaS, typical like enterprise closed source proprietary SaaS, well, what is the funnel that we want to care about, right? And so the pretext on this is that obviously this funnel, different companies have slightly different funnels, but they all take a shape that somewhat resembles what I'm showing here. And the open source funnel that we're going to talk about today is something that also, like, your product, your project may be slightly different, but ultimately this is a kind of more general framework that will be broadly applicable here. And so the first part of the funnel, the top of the funnel, is just interest. And that's nothing new, right? Like someone landing on your homepage for your marketing site is showing interest, and you're tracking that right now. And you might be tracking some of these other things right now, but the context of open source here is a little bit different, right? So we obviously have GitHub stars, just someone that is just signaling some kind of interest. Like they might just want to be bookmarking it for later. They might just want to show support, or they might be, literally very interested in the project. And I am the first one to bash stars as a metric that you should be tracking. I think there's a lot of problems with stars, but it does have some of these qualities of this immediately uncovers the identity of the person and allows you to get in touch with them. But broader than that, we still have this notion of, web traffic and uniques from that web traffic, and, the social media touch points with your audience, and all these kinds of typical things. But there's the open source specific aspects where we do have documentation that our users are going to read for the first time. They may read your quick start, your tutorial, your, what is this project kind of, that initial content. And so what we mean with interest is all this is someone who has kind of demonstrated the smallest amount of just awareness about our project. And so, this, I would say, not hugely different from what we are traditionally looking at, but some of the signals are a little bit different, and the intent behind these signals are a little bit different as well. The people showing interest may not be your buyer. They might be, the developer using your product, even though your buyer is someone totally different. And so, often understanding at the account level, for these things can be very, very useful. So you can track things like, one person from the company came and then someone else from the company came later, and these kinds of things. So I think here, not too much that's new, but still framing this in the particular context of an open source funnel is going to be very powerful. And as we start to, broad strokes paint this with the rest of the funnel, I think will become a lot more clear. However, I think it is important with each of these steps of the funnel, we want to point out, like, okay, cool, like someone's in the interest phase, but what do we do with this? this is your first touch point with these folks, and so this is the time where all those introductory materials, the quick start, the on ramp. This is your first chance to connect with these folks, and so this is where stars can actually be very useful to make sure that you're staying on top of getting in touch with folks that you can, starting to track which companies these interested parties belong to, and trying to nurture those relationships. The content that you want to target these people with are very different in each part of the funnel. And so by having a more open source specific funnel helps you do the most targeted marketing that you can. Okay. So next we have the investigation phase. And this is something that I think looks a little bit different in open source than it does otherwise, right? Like, most of these developers landing on your GitHub are not going to book a demo, right? They already have access to the software, and that's what they're going to be looking at and using. And so um, what we mean by investigation is that the user is actually showing that they're taking action to learn more. To learn more, to get updates, to really dive in, and maybe they download the software, right? And so whether this is someone who you just like taught, someone maybe signs up for an event that you're hosting, like a webinar. Um, but maybe what they're doing is they're looking at your README and then downloading the software. And so what's really crucial at the investigation phase um, is that this is where you start having a lot of meaningful drop off, right? Like, for instance, on the interest phase, like, there's a lot of folks that they may read they may read a little bit about what you do and say, oh, okay, this is cool, but this is not really not as relevant to me as I thought, or this does not solve a pain point that I currently have. Um, in the investigation phase, it's a little bit more validated, right? Like, this is in the ballpark of something that they care about, and they're going to spend some time to learn more about it. And so, immediately here, right? If someone is reading your README, or some of your documentation, but they never go on to download it, that's already a conversion rate that you care about, right? Um, you've made these sacrifices to do open source, to broaden your user base, to eliminate the friction, to make sure that anyone can use your software. Um, and so good docs can totally mess all that up, right? It can throw a wrench in the whole thing if people read your crappy README and say, "Oh, this doesn't seem like it solves my problem," then they bounce. And so that's why it can be really, really important to track your downloads, because that is how you measure, that first, both that first impression, but actually how effective that first impression was at actually driving them to the next stage. And again, all of this is taking place in a spot that you probably can't see very well. They're not necessarily giving you their email address. Most often they're not. Um, all they really have to go on is some content that you've made and some artifacts that they might want to download. However, as soon as they do download it, like, now you have someone who's really ready to try out your software, right? Um, of course, we do have, again, some of the more traditional touch points here, like signups. People might sign up for your newsletter. If you have a hosted product, like a cloud platform, maybe they sign up for it and are kicking the tires and trying it out. But ultimately, in the open source world here, we have this is a very, very critical moment, because this is where people are really doing stuff on their own, but none of the friction is there. So if someone bounces and leaves, exits here, it's really something that you didn't have a lot of visibility into, but it's really just kind of purely the value proposition, the positioning and messaging that you have for your project. And it's really the test of how effective that is, right? And so if you are not tracking documentation to download conversion rates, you're missing one of the most important, one of the most important tests of your project's messaging and positioning. And so, as open source marketers, it's crucial to track this. It's crucial to be able to correlate a view of your docs or your website to someone doing a pip install, a Docker pull, an npm install, all these kinds of things. Like, this is a really, really important bridge to cross. They're from, oh, I'm just reading about this, to I'm actually trying it out for the first time. It's a really important step for your user journey, and it's critical that you're tracking these things in a way that you can attribute and correlate with these events. Did they hear about us from an event that we did for the first time? Did they hear about us from a social media post? And how do those different channels correlate with your conversion rates to get them to try the software for the first time? And of course, here with the documentation as well, is like, it's nice when someone shows up for the first time, but are they, how much time are they spending in your docs, and how much are they reading about it, and which pages, right? Like, the blog, someone reading your blog post is not the same kind of intent signal as someone looking at your company's pricing page, the download page, the troubleshooting page. These all signal kinds of different levels of intent when it comes to learning more about your project. But really, what you're pushing them to do is download it and try it for yourself, or sign up for our product to try it in a more managed way if you don't want to put in the elbow grease yourself, which ultimately is what you're selling. So the middle of the funnel for an open source project and a commercial open source company is when they start to actually experiment with the software, right? They've gone from, yeah, this looks interesting, to maybe we're building a prototype of a new product that is going to use your open source library. Or maybe we're going to build a proof of concept of a new app that's going to use your open source database, or whatever that looks like. This also is a very critical moment in the user journey here. And again, if we look back at the traditional funnel, it's not here, right? We don't know when someone actually starts using, like, experimenting with the software and building stuff on top of it for the first time, because most of the people are never going to tell you about it, right? Most of these developers, like, the stuff is all frictionless. And so while that has huge advantages, the drawback is you're often not seeing what's going on here at this very critical time, where there's a few things that have been satisfied, right? You have a prospect who has signaled, I know about this tool. I have a need that it may actually address, but I haven't solved this problem yet. And that's a really critical thing, right? As a company starts to really experiment with your software, the need has been qualified and validated for you, and they have not solved the problem yet. This is the moment where you need to be selling. You need to be connecting with these people who are experimenting with the software, and be as helpful as possible. This is the time. This is the time to demonstrate that your business has additional value to provide beyond the software that you've already given them. And that's what I think a lot of these commercial open source businesses get really wrong, is where you give away the product for free, and then your business has nothing additional to provide. And so you're basically competing with your open source, and you get out competed by your open source, because your open source is commoditized while your company is selling. And so in the in the experimentation phase, there's some really important metrics that we need to be looking at as marketers. And so, not just the raw downloads, but the scrub downloads. How many users do we actually have? For any given company, how many people at that company are actually using this, right? As soon as our downloads are not coming from just one developer, but are coming from a whole team at that company of developers, oh, our kindling is starting to catch fire. And this is the really important time to be connecting with these prospects and talking to them and getting feedback, right? And so both the number of unique users helps us understand, how big is this user base? how big is this market that we are trying to upsell into customers of our product, our services, our platform, our support, offering, whatever that looks like. This is where people are running into trouble. This is where people are getting stuck. This is where people are having misunderstandings. And we, the company around the software, have a chance to provide value in a way that we can actually monetize, right? And so tracking things like unique users per organization gives us a really, really critical metric to look at where, to really have staying power within a given company, we need to see the number of unique the number of unique users at a company to increase over time, and not to churn, right? And then, of course, we also want to track how many new companies are showing up too. So it's not just a matter of like, look, great, we posted our thing on Hacker News or on Reddit or wherever, and we get a huge influx in traffic, and then it might dissipate the next day. So what you're really left with is the people who actually took the next step to learn more, to try it out, and to really start using it and get a feel for it. And so seeing how many net new companies are getting into this part of the middle section of our funnel, is really critical, right? And so after they've downloaded it, they're going to come back to your docs to continue to learn how to use, the tool, the library, the application, whatever it is that you are building and commercializing. And so documentation usage after downloads is a really, really, really critical piece here because it gives us clues about how the software is being used. What features are they reading about? Are they reading about our pricing for our commercial offering or not? Are they looking at the troubleshooting guide? What are they getting stuck on? And so the experimentation phase gives us as marketers a very specific moment in their journey where we have the potential to give them very specific help. Um, tools and techniques that they can use to get the most out of this. They've not yet solved their problem. So this is where they have enough skin in the game that they are going to be very receptive to getting the help from you so they can actually get their problem solved because they haven't yet solved it. And so the kinds of activities that we do as marketers when the experimentation phase is reached can really make or break if they're going to roll this out into production or not. This is where a lot of our time needs to be spent, right? Because there's enough drop off at each step of the funnel that this group is tractable to really focus on and give very personalized help to. If you can figure out who they are and get on the phone with them, get on Zoom with them, to really talk to them and understand what their needs are, and if your open source is solving it. And like specifically, you may not, you may be in a position where your open source is so good that they solve their problem definitively with it and they never need your business again because you've already given them the software for free, and with a little bit of elbow grease they've got it all figured out. And so the experimentation time is the time to help them solve their problem, but also prove that your business has additional value to add on top of the open source that you've already given them. And that's what's really hard, right? We in the commercial open source space, like we are so helpful from the very beginning. You don't even need to talk to us to get the help, and you may not ever need to talk to us. And the way that we're tracking this stuff can really dictate, it can really dictate a company's ability to drive conversion at the experimentation phase and get more ongoing users, right? The bottom of the funnel. So this is the set of companies that rely on your software, right? You may want to look at things like how often are they re-downloading the software over time? But even more specifically, maybe how often are they updating to the next version after we cut a release, right? A company that is consistently downloading the latest stable release over time shows much stronger intent signals than a company that has downloaded 100,000 times in 1 week of your latest version of your package, right? Like these version numbers matter. If you are in the business of selling open source support, the version usage is actually really critical to you, because the folks who are stuck on old versions might be stuck for reasons that you can help with. Um, if a company is stuck on like a really old, like end of life version of some piece of software, there might be a reason they haven't done it, and the reason might not be very good. Um, and that's where you can help. Um, if your users are often stuck on old versions, that also means that you have users that are vulnerable to whatever kinds of security issues have been introduced in the software that you may have fixed. And so, the version adoption rates, I think, are really, really important, from a marketing perspective and a sales perspective, because they're really going to signal, the engagement levels with the software, the criticality of the software to their business. um, and it really gives you a strong intent signal that you can actually work with. And of course, the whether you're selling support services or SaaS or whatever, that may have an impact about how much you care about this stuff. But at the end of the day, this metric of version upgrade rates will be a really critical one to measure and understand. And it's not really enough to just look at the totals of this stuff, again, because what we saw before, the download data can be very noisy, right? What if we had 5 million Docker downloads? Well, how many uniques did that come from? How many of those uniques were from the same organization? And so you just don't really know until you're tracking the stuff at that kind of level, right? The ongoing users are also going to be opening issues. They're hopefully going to be contributing code to you and just generally engaging with your community. And all these things are great, right? But the ones that actually interact with your community is really just the tip of the iceberg. Most people are not going to get in touch with you. And that's just the reality. Most people are not going to raise their hands and say, "Hey, I use this and it's great. Thank you." Or, "Hey, I use this and I need help. I don't know why this thing is happening, and I would pay to unblock myself here." That's not going to happen most of the time. And so it's critical for our businesses that we are tracking the ongoing users. These are the people who rely on our software, and these are the ones that, I think that often in the open source world, this notion of value creation and value capture is not one that we like to talk about, because we are, you know, the values of open source focus much more on value creation. We want to create value from others, and capturing value, I don't know, just sounds a little bit worse, and it sounds self-interested. And in some ways it is, but in other ways, like this, the value capture is paramount to your business, or you're not going to be making more open source for anybody, because you're not going to be in business at all. Um, and so the the tracking of your ongoing users is the most ripe group to reach out to, to engage with, to have a commercial offering, to sell a commercial offering, because these are the people who you've solved a problem for. However, you need to make sure that you have additional value to provide these users, or they're going to continue to use your software quietly, productively, and for free forever. And you're not going to have an opportunity to sell them additional value, to sell them additional things, because you've largely already solved their problem in a way that they're happy with. Um, but you can start to detect things where there's hiccups and opportunities for you to come in and sell more stuff, to market more stuff. And so, things like the growth rate of your of the growth rate of the number of unique users that you have in a given company, um, can be a really crucial thing to look at, right? You may be in use at a huge enterprise, but it's only one team that really uses it. And so that one team may be happily doing stuff. They use your open source, it's all great. But then things get much harder when another team wants to use the same stuff. Maybe they need tools so that they can use that software in a hosted, managed way, so that their different teams can work together at the same time with your tool, right? Maybe they need more, better security and compliance features, and all these kinds of things that we might be selling around our open source, that we really are not going to know until we see that the usage, the internal adoption within a given company is starting to grow. Those growth rates within a company is paramount to be tracking. And if you're not looking at the usage of the open source, again, if you're back here in the traditional funnel world, you're going to miss when the internal adoption, little bonfire turns into like a roaring, burning fire that is something that you can really start to provide a lot of additional value from. Um, and again, the other thing here is that you don't want to be stuck in a spot where you've given away your product for free, not your software, but your actual product for free, and these ongoing users are never really going to need you. You've already solved their problem fully, fully, fully. And so that's where things like, the churn rates, the net user retention, the cohort analysis, the stuff that's really commonplace, in the go-to-market world for traditional SaaS gets much harder here, because you're gonna have you may be tracking churn of your enterprise product, of your support offering, whatever that is, but people can churn off of your business onto the open source, right? People can be just using the open source and churn off of that. And churn rates, I think, are a thing that we don't talk about much in the open source world because it's been so hard to measure, right? Um, but if you're able to track the downloads and the usage of your software over time, you're going to be able to actually understand this. And depending on what you build, you may need to care about churn more or less. And just to give an example here, so if I am working on operating systems, really low level stuff, programming languages, infrastructure, my churn needs to be really close to zero. It's a lot of work to adopt a new operating system at a big company. It's a lot of work to move to another one. And so if you have a lot of churn, if you even have like a bit of churn, if you're really low level like that, you have problems, right? That's really, really bad. If people are going through tremendous friction just to leave, just to leave your software or your product. If you're more application level, it might matter a bit less, but it's still something that you need to track. So you need to know what conversion, what churn rates do you actually, what are you targeting there? Like what's a reasonable, net user retention? How is that net user retention growing or shrinking over time, right? And then finally, like you're going to want to track the size of your open source user base and the size of your customer base, because again, that's these people who are using your software and relying on it. They're going to engage with your content more. They're going to read the emails that you send them. They're going to respond to you. They're going to engage with you. People who rely on your software are going to be more engaged targets of marketing than folks who don't. And that is just, I mean, I think that's very intuitive, but also our data shows this as well, that like we have customers where as soon as they have a prospect that hits the ongoing usage category, they're about 2.5 times more likely to respond to outreach than those who were not. And so understanding who relies on your software very heavily is one of the most important things that you need to be doing, as an open source marketer, because that's your target audience for upselling. That's who you need to be sending. These are your power users, right? Like you want to be sending them all the materials to get them, to that next level of effectiveness with using your project, your solution. These are the people that you want attending your events. You want to get case studies. You want to get testimonials. You want your users to be evangelizing your product for you. And this is the segment of people who can do that. If you can get ongoing users to be talking to your experimentation users, now you've made evangelists out of your user base, and that's going to help you grow and grow and grow. And so again, like as people flow down this funnel from interest to investigation, to experimentation, and then to ongoing usage, the marketing motions look a little bit different. You're trying to be helpful at every given stage as a marketer to push them into, to get them towards your paid offerings. But what they need help with looks very different at every stage, right? At ongoing usage, your software has solved the pain point. maybe it has not solved it completely, or maybe it solved it in a way that's not perfect. Um, but that's the stage at which you have someone relying on you. You have someone who's bought in, they're gonna be more engaged, and your marketing activities are gonna be, very, very effective, and that's where you can have, really, really loyal customers that that are there forever because they had a free on-ramp and you were able to provide additional products and services that help solve their, pain points, very completely. Um, and then when you have folks that churn from here, that's a really big deal, right? Someone who starts using your software a little bit, they're trying it out and then they leave is a very different signal from someone who introduced your library into their stack, deployed it to production, was using it for 6 months or a year, and then ripped it out. It's a much different thing, right? And that's something that you really need to try to get ahead of as much as possible and really like understand very deeply. These are harder signals to spot than someone hitting cancel in your SaaS product, or sending you an email that they're not going to renew their support contract this year because they didn't really need the support services, or whatever it might look like. um, these kinds of users do churn, and you do need to be plugged into that, and so tracking the usage of your open source software is paramount in this way. So overall, like, really the thing here is that you need to build a better funnel for your software that more cleanly maps to the world of open source adoption and open source usage. Just a different motion. It's a different process. And if you are treating this open source funnel more like a traditional marketing funnel, you're going to have mismatches. You're not measuring the things that matter. And the things that you are measuring might be misleading or giving you kind of an incomplete or just incorrect picture of what's actually going on. And so, I've talked about a lot of things that you should be doing, and ways that you should be thinking about these kinds of marketing activities for a commercial open source company. Um, but what's tricky is, okay, how do we actually do this, right? And so, here's the part where I plug what we do. So with Scarf, you get a way to run this open source qualified lead process, right? To actually find folks in that funnel to identify these potential customers who have qualified themselves by their usage of your open source, right? Um, they're not necessarily folks that like they're not necessarily um, people that your marketing efforts have validated. It's just the fact that they're using your open source enough that they have shown that what you do solves a pain point that they have, right? And so Scarf gives you a way to collect this data, to tie this data from GitHub and PyPI and Anaconda and whatever registry you're distributing your stuff on, to take this data, put it into one place, correlate the different events at the company level, but still in a way that's compliant, GDPR compliant, promotes preserves user privacy. Um, and all the other things that you want in an analytics tool, but specifically geared more towards open source. And so, again, like the intent signals that we're working with here in the open source world are a bit different, right? Like the user who downloads your software twice in a year, but they're stable versions and they read your docs sometimes, is actually a much stronger intent signal than someone that's just thrashing around with your artifacts and downloading them a bunch, and then you don't really see them much in the next year, or these kinds of things. You never see them again, maybe. And so, the point here is that um, these signals that we are looking at as marketers, the things that we use to infer intent signals and really compute a lead score, are different for open source. And if we are not thinking about them differently, we're going to continue to fall into the same, traps and pitfalls and things that just make commercial open source historically very, very challenging. But I think that if we are able to adapt our marketing processes to better map to the reality of the user journeys that we actually have, we're going to see more successful businesses around open source. We're going to see more sustainable open source. We're going to see more open source. And I think that's a world that everyone here can likely get on board with, that we all want to see more open source in the world, and we want to see the people who build it be more successful. And so if this is a problem that, if this is a problem that resonates with you, something that you've been struggling with, want to do better at, I highly encourage you to check Scarf out. It might be able to help you run some of these processes in a bit blurred way. Or we're always just happy to, share any learnings that we have with this kind of stuff for how, the best commercial open source companies are doing this kind of thing at scale. And so that is all I have. Thank you so much for listening. Thanks again to Open Teams for having me for this webinar. I hope that this way of thinking about your open source marketing funnel proves useful to you. And now I can take any questions that you might have. Thanks again.